Hello friends, it's Chari. Today I am back with some more cake cards. Today I am creating winter build-a-cake cards. So of course every cake card starts out with the build-a-cake die set and the add-on. I did go through my dies to find some more elements to pull in for these cute winter cakes. So I had the Build-a-Birdhouse Christmas add-on for the little pine boughs and the pine cones. I have the Build a Snow Globe set. I use the trees. I also use the little bird. I'll show you here in a minute. I use the trees with the village hillside border. So I have two kind of different shapes and styles of Christmas trees. And I also pulled in the berries from the mistletoe die set. I also pulled in a couple elements from the Build a Drink mug add-on, the cinnamon sticks and the star anise, and I'm also using this citrus slice from the Build a Drink margarita. And then here is that little bird that is from the Build a Snow Globe set. I will use that as well. Now the first cake I'm creating today is what I'm calling the frosty cake. I want to make a 3-layered cake in an ombre color. So I have peacock, mermaid, and white. And I'm using the die that cuts this large cake into 3 equal parts. I'm just checking it with the topper piece to make sure I have it in the right spot. And I'm going to hold this in place with a little bit of low tack tape and run this through my die cut machine. And this will cut this peacock cake into 3 equal slices. Now, to make sure that I put this die in the exact same place for all 3 of these cakes, I'm going to take that bottom piece, line it up with the bottom of the mermaid cake, and this is much easier to do flat on the desk. Then I'm taking the die and I'm just going to butt it right up against the edge of that peacock die cut. Then I can hold it in place with low tack tape, remove that peacock piece, run it through, and now my mermaid cake is cut in the exact same spot. Now I'm repeating the process with the white one, but I'm using the top of the mermaid cake to do this. So I'm just lining it up again with the top, and I will take that die and butt it up against that die cut so I know it's in the right place, hold it in place with that tape, and run it through, and I will have 3 layers of the white. So now I know all of these are cut to the exact same size. Now for this cake, I want a white top, I want a mermaid middle, and I want a peacock bottom. Actually, you could make 3 cakes by using all these pieces if you wanted to. I'm just going to set those aside for later. Then I have a solid cake cut from white cardstock, and this is where I'm just going to assemble my pieces. So I'm putting my adhesive all over, and I will start with the bottom piece. Then I can layer on the center, and then the top white piece. And now I have a fully stacked ombre cake. Now for the top layer here with that little scallop detail, I did cut this from some pixie dust white sparkle cardstock, so we have some shimmer for the top. And this is going to go with all the snowflakes I cut. For the plate, I did use some silver metallic cardstock. I'm just going to go ahead and add that to the plate, and this is going to match the other snowflakes I cut. I cut snowflakes from pixie dust and holographic cardstock. I also have the little icing detail cut from the pixie dust white sparkle cardstock. And now I am ready to decorate with all these snowflakes. I cut a lot of them. I did not use all of them on this cake, but I like to have choices when figuring out my placement for all the little decorative items. I did use the holographic ones because I thought they would show up better on the white sparkle top. So once I have my snowflakes kind of laid out where I want them to be, I'm just going to use my pick up pokey tool, pick each one of them up, add a little dot of glue, and then drop them back into place. And I didn't show it before, but I did use the mini snowflakes die to cut out all these snowflakes. I actually leave mine attached and run it through all at once and get a whole bunch of snowflakes to use. And I usually keep all the extras that I don't use on a project in a little cup on my desk just to grab a snowflake when you might need one. Now for these snowflakes on the top, I'm just adding liquid glue to the bottom where it's going to touch my icing. And then for this last one, I am actually going to glue that to the back of this one sticking up so they look like they're kind of floating down towards the cake. And my sentiment's going to go on that little banner you see there, and I will add some more snowflakes to that as well. So we have snowflakes everywhere on this card. And I'm just cleaning up a little bit of glue on that metallic plate, which is really easy to do because of that metallic cardstock. You can just kind of wipe that off. For the sentiment, I'm using the Henry's Jr.'s Build a Sentiment Winter to spell out the sentiment that just says let it snow. I've cut that stitched sentiment banner out of white cardstock, and I'm going to stamp this sentiment kind of towards the right side because I am going to do like I've done on some of the other cakes and fold this sentiment banner over on that toothpick that you see there to create like a little flag. So I'm folding this behind. This little toothpick's going to go right in there, so we're going to add some liquid glue on both sides, right in that little crease, and we'll just sandwich this toothpick in there, and I will use my tweezers to kind of hold this closed while that glue sets. So once that's nice and dry, I can add this to my cake by putting a little bit of liquid glue on the front part of my toothpick, and I will glue this to the back of the cake. I think this is a fun way to make the sentiment part of the cake decoration. And I am using some flat toothpicks to do this, but of course use whatever you have in your kitchen. Now to add some snowflakes up here to the sentiment to decorate that a little bit, I'm just adding a couple dots of glue and I will add my little snowflakes kind of around my sentiment, which is also why I left some white space on the right side before I got to the end of the banner so I'd have a place to glue some more snowflakes, and I just think this is turning out so pretty. Now I wanted to stick with the monotone look of this card by keeping the same colors for the background, and I decided to go with this ice blue bokeh paper. This is a 12 by 12. I'm actually going to use the side with the really big circles, and I'm cutting this out with the largest of the outside in stitch rectangles, and I will put this onto a white card base. And then I have that little thin white frame around my pattern paper panel. And then I have also added some foam squares to the back. I even use those little micro foam squares in the center of those snowflakes on top of the cake so that they're all supported. Now before I stick this down, I wanted to add a little texture to this with some twine. And I did leave a void on the back of my cake where I can have my twine. I'm going to wrap this around 3 times. I like to cross it over. I think it gives it a little more dynamic look than just straight across, and then I'm going to tie my bow on the left side. And this is the white hemp twine. I'm just checking to make sure it's kind of far enough over. I do need to slide it down a little bit to get it sort of in that pocket that I created from the phone tape, but that's really easy to do. So here I'm just shifting it down a little bit. That looks pretty good. I'll trim off the ends of that twine, and then I can pull off all the liner paper on the back and stick this down. I am going to redo these 2 little foam squares at the bottom, and I'm adding a strip down there because I want to support that little slit that's in the plate. I didn't want that kind of hanging out, so I'm adding a couple more foam squares there and making sure that that foam strip went across that cut that's in the plate. Then I'm pulling off all those pieces of liner paper, and as I said, I have some little micro foam squares on the back of those 2 snowflakes, which is going to support them very nicely. And then I can just pop this onto the card base. I did add a little bit of liquid glue to the back of the toothpick. Not that that's really necessary, but just to kind of hold everything in place. And I will center this up on the card. And I just think that turned out so pretty. Now, this is a frosty, snowy cake, so we're not done without some more bling. I have these really small iridescent clear sequins that I'm adding around. You could also add some clear gems if you wanted, anything that gives that frosty, icy look. But I just thought this would be an extra fun little embellishment. And I'm adding them to the cake as well as the background. And then I'm adding a little bit of Stardust Stickles to the background paper, just picking out some random circles in that pattern paper and adding just a little hint of that glitter to them just to add some more shimmer to the background. When I pick this up and turn it in the light, you're going to see that shimmer on those bokeh circles in the background. It goes great with all that shimmer and shine on the cake. And I just love how this frosty cake turned out. Now, this cake is a spice cake, and this one might be my favorite that I made today in today's video. I am starting out with these oranges. This is actually the lime from the Margarita Build-A-Drink die set. So that solid back piece is cut from pumpkin cardstock, and I just put some adhesive runner all over it. Then I added the wagon wheel shape, which is the pith of the orange. That is cut from speckled eggshell cardstock. And then I'm dropping in the slices that go inside, and those are cut from fake tan. And once I have all that in place, I'm just kind of burnishing it down with my bone folder, and then I'm taking my adhesive eraser and removing any of the adhesive that's on the outside of that pith on the rind. So you can put that adhesive all over if it's dry adhesive like that, and then use this to kind of clean it up. So I did the same thing to all of these, and this one I'm cutting in half. So I have some variation with full slices and that half slice. Now for the cake, this is cut from paper bag cardstock for that kind of classic spice cake color, but I didn't want it to be as tall as the die cuts it. So I am realigning the sides of the die and shifting it up to where that top part is past the top of the cake, and I'm going to make a slightly shorter cake. So I still want a nice big wide cake, but I just don't want it as tall. And this is a fun way to get even more out of your die set. So if you don't want a tall cake, you can always trim it down. For the icing, I wanted it to look like a classic cream cheese icing, so I cut this from speckled eggshell cardstock. I'm just adding my adhesive all over it, and I'm going to line up those slits so it's on the top of the cake. Then I used some storm cloud cardstock for the cake pedestal. So now it's time to decorate my spice cake with all these fun things that I have found in my stash. So first off, I have these cinnamon sticks from the Build-A-Drink mug add-on. I also have the star anise from that. And of course, my orange slices that I created from the Build-A-Drink margarita. And I'm starting out with that orange slice in the middle, then adding my cinnamon sticks. I have this little sprig. That is from the Build-A-Birdhouse Christmas add-on, and I think it looks like pine or rosemary, whatever you're wanting to put on your cake. I also found these little berries from the Merry Mistletoe die set, and they made the perfect little cranberries to add to my spice cake. And so I'm just adding things all around, having a whole lot of fun decorating this cake with all these very festive decorations. Then I'm adding my half orange slice down here towards the bottom and just decorating it around the bottom of the cake. I did not put the icing detail at the bottom of this cake. I wanted it to look a little more natural and not as fancy, and I love the way it turned out. And then I'm adding a couple more cranberries down there with that orange. I took one of those little sprigs and cut one of those pieces off, so I only have two. And I'm just adding that to the left side with a couple more of my bright red cranberries. Now for the background of this card, I'm using the quilted diamond backdrop and some kraft cardstock. And then I'm also pulling out the oval that coordinates with the giant holiday messages, and I'm going to use this to create a focal point behind my cake with the favorite flannel fall paper. I'm going with that green, of course, to kind of stick with that winter holiday kind of vibe. So I'm just lining this up with the orthogonal plaid on here. So I'm making sure that that top and bottom scallop line up with the same stripe, so I know it's nice and straight and centered. I'll just run this through my die cut machine, and now I have this fun oval to place behind my cake. I just thought this was a really fun way to give it a focal point. Now I don't want it peeking out at the bottom down there, so I'm actually going to trim off that oval. So I'm figuring out about where I want it to be. I'm going to mark it with a pencil, and I will just trim this down with my paper trimmer to be shorter than my cake. I am going to use a cream colored card base for this so that it matches the cream color of my icing and my cake when it peeks through those little openings in this backdrop. And I'm using liquid glue to make sure that's nice and stuck down. Then I can add my focal point of my oval. And this background is really nice because you can get it nice and centered using that kind of grid of that diamond quilted pattern on the background to make sure it's nice and straight and centered. Then I am actually going to add my cake, but I'm going to use some foam adhesive to add that. So I've put my strips on the back and a couple little squares to support some of those smaller areas, and I'm just going to pop this right in the center, right over that scalloped oval. For the sentiment on this card, I'm using a wavy sentiment banner cut from speckled eggshell cardstock and the Winter Wavy Sayings stamp set for the sentiment that says joyful wishes. I like that this stamp set has lots of options that fit into this wavy banner depending on what you want your card to say. And I'm just adding some foam squares to the back, and I'm going to pop this right above the cake in that oval. And this fits really well since I made my cake a little bit shorter on this card. I wanted to add a bow to the cake stand at the bottom, and this kraft twine is perfect. I'm actually going to cut 2 lengths and trim them off so I'm tying a double bow just to have a little more texture and heft to it. Once I get that bow tied nice and tight, I am going to add this to the cake plate with a dot of glue. And I'll just use my reverse tweezers to hold it in place while that dot of glue dries and trim off the ends. Of course, we need some sparkle on this cake, or I would call it sugar, so I'm adding it to the oranges, the cranberries, the rosemary, actually all of the elements on the cake, including the edge of the icing. And then I am pulling out one more of those little sprigs that I cut, and I thought it was perfect just right up here at the top of this sentiment. And here is my finished winter spice cake, which is perfect for winter or the holidays, or even a perfect birthday card. My last cake for today is inspired by the idea of a winter woodland walk. So this one's going to be 2 tiers cut out of kraft cardstock, and I'm going to do a little stenciling on this with the Winter Sprigs stencil set. So this is a 3-part stencil set. They are numbered 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to start with number 1, and I'm using my grip mat to hold it in place. And I want a tone-on-tone pattern on this kraft cardstock, so I am using dough ink. I started out with a large blending brush but decided to switch over to a smaller one to kind of keep it a little more controlled. And I am using this same color through all 3 of these stencils. Now, if you were making a background, you would probably use green on this one because it's the greenery. You would use red for the berries and brown for the pine cones, but I am going to use dough for all 3. And actually using the grip mat let me do both layers of the cake at the same time, which was very nice. Now once I have all 3 of these stencils done, I'm actually going in with that same dough ink to kind of tone down the contrast between the ink and the kraft cardstock a little bit. And then you can see here are my toppers. So once I have it inked the way I want, I'll clean off my desk so I don't get any of that brown ink on my white toppers. And I'm just adding this to the top. And this to me was supposed to look like a snowy ground in the forest. You can see there I have a bunch of pine trees cut. These are cut from 2 different colors of green and using 2 different tree dyes. I'm also adding my little icing detail at the bottom. This is cut from paper bag cardstock so that it doesn't stand out too much and blends in with that craft colored cake. And of course, for the little one, I just needed to cut off 2 of those little icing details for it to fit. Then I'm putting my 2 layers together, and then I use chocolate bar cardstock for the plate. So a lot of neutral colors going on the cake itself. Then I'm pulling in my trees. These trees are from the Build a Snow Globe die set and the Hillside Village border die, and I cut them from algae and noble fir cardstock. And once I figured out my placement, I'm just coming back through with a glue tube and making sure everything gets put in place. And I just think this turned out so pretty with all the trees around. I also have those pine cones that are cut from some chocolate bar cardstock. Those are from the Build-a-Birdhouse Christmas add-on, and I'm just going to tuck them on the bottom layer there. This little tiny bird worked out perfect. It was the perfect size for these little trees. I also cut some more of those little pine boughs from the Build a Birdhouse Christmas add-on, and they seem to be the perfect little thing to tuck around on my little decorations as well. And I added one to each little cluster with the trees, and that was just the perfect little added detail. So here is my winter woods cake, and instead of splattering it with a bunch of metallic, this time I'm actually going to paint it on. So you can see I am picking up some dots of paint, dropping it where the little dots of the stencil are, and then I'm going to just trace those pine boughs and the leaves from the stencil. And you can't really see it very well right now, but once I pick it up and kind of turn it in the light, you're going to see that gold shimmer, and it turned out so pretty. I am going to add some snowy splatter to this too once I get all my little shimmery pieces on there. I'm doing it to the stencil background, but I am also going to add some little bit of shimmer to the tops of those icing details at the bottom, those brown icing details. Now here is my white splatter paint, and I am flicking it off the brush to give some very fine snowy splatters to the entire cake. I want it on the trees, I want it on the cake, it's on the birds. Everything looks like it has been snowed on, and when I pick this up, you can see that gold shimmer. It's so pretty. For the background, I pulled out the Favorite Flannel Petite paper pack, and I'm going to go with this blue for the background. It's kind of a nice wintry blue. At first I wanted to do the dark blue, but my trees kind of disappeared on that, so I went with this color, and I think it turned out so pretty. So I'm lining up a stitch rectangle. This is the largest stitch rectangle, so it is 4¼ by 5½, and I've just made sure that's straight in my die. And then I will add this to a card base. For the sentiment on this card, I am going with the sentiment that says warm and cozy wishes. I built this sentiment with Henry's Jr.'s Build a Sentiment Winter and the birthday set to get the word wishes. And you can see I've already white embossed it once with the words stacked on the same stamp, but I wanted them a little bit closer. I didn't want as much space between the first line and the second line, so I'm doing it again on the kraft cardstock and stamping them separate. Then I will heat it up with my heat tool and melt that white embossing powder. And now you can see they're a little closer together, and it's going to fit into my sentiment banner much better this way. So I'll line this up and hold this in place with some tape and run this through my die cut machine. And this little banner is going to come off the top left corner. I did decide to pull that brush that had the dough ink just left on it. I didn't even put any more on it, and make it match the cake a little bit more by adding some ink. And I'll just buff it off of the embossing. So when you have a big cake like this, sometimes it is hard to find a place for a sentiment, but I think that this little sentiment in this top corner worked perfectly. And luckily with that grid of the pattern paper, it's easy to make sure it's nice and straight. Then I can trim off the excess that's hanging over the side, and then I will add foam squares all over the back of my cake. Now I did already stick this on once and pull it off, and because I realized that my tree in the middle is not dead center, so I pulled it off so I could shift it over and get my cake nice and centered. It was just slightly to the left, which you may have not noticed, but I noticed. So I am fixing that little problem that I created. And then I'm going to pull out the snowflakes that I cut for the first card. I have a whole bunch over here left over. And I'm going to use the white ones, the white glitter ones that are left over, to just add some snowflakes around my cake. And I decided to kind of add a couple to the cake, only down here on the bottom. And then all the ones I'm adding around it, you'll notice I'm making sure they're all straight up and down to kind of go with the orthogonal grid of the flannel. But I think that was the perfect little added touch. Now for the glitter on this one, I am glittering my birds, and then I am also going to add little bits of glitter just to the bottoms of the boughs of the tree to look as if they've been dusted by some snow and ice. I'll also add a little bit to the pine cones and the little pine boughs too, just so everything looks like it's been dusted a little bit. And here is that finished winter woods card, and look at that shimmer of that gold. I just think that's such a fun little detail that's unexpected. So here's a look at all the winter cakes. We have the winter woodland cake, we have the winter spice cake, and the winter frosty cake. So I hope you've enjoyed this next installment in the Build a Cake card series, and I hope it has inspired you to create some beautiful winter cakes. Thank you so much for watching. Have an amazing day. Bye.